The title of my talk today is Beyond Compliance, Thinking Accessibly in the Digital Humanities. And this is going to be sort of unusual for Assess to talk because I'm not sharing any original research that I've just come out with or I'm working on, although it does intersect a little bit with one of my major research areas, which is blindness and disability in the Bible and ancient Middle East. But this talk is really one where I come in and tell you all how to do your jobs. The topic of accessibility is one that I realize can often be opaque and completely mystifying, as most people I run into have the greatest intentions to be accessible and to make everything, the desire to make everything they produce accessible to people with a variety of disabilities, but just don't know how to start, where to do it, how to be effective, or even how to go about learning those things. In this talk, I want to go beyond sort of normal or common approaches to accessibility that view it as a burden to be added on at the last minute, to check the compliance box of Section 508 or the ADA, and move to a model where we think accessibly about the creation of our data and our data publications from the outset in ways that make the creation of accessible final products much easier. So I am going to, in my talk, it's going to take two major parts. The first part will be, I'm going to go over some high-level disability and accessibility theory to get sort of the conceptual foundation we're working with, and then some basic best principles and best practices. After that, I'm going to stop the screen share and restart with sharing my system audio, as I am a screen reader user, and I'm going to give you a demonstration of some of the principles that we looked at in the first half in practice, so that you can see how responsible data practices and an attention to accessibility from the beginning makes for a much easier user experience or reading experience for disabled users. All right. So first, to give you a little bit of history, we're going to talk about models of disability and how they affect thinking about accessibility and designing for accessibility. First, we're going to talk about the medical model. It's important to understand that the medical model was only theorized by those seeking to overcome and reject it. So nobody is going to say, I am a proud proponent of the medical model of disability. Rather, this is a pervasive attitude toward disability that was identified and theorized starting really in the mid-20th century by groups of self-organizing people with various disabilities. And really, we're going to find over the course of the history of disability and accessibility that it is the self-organization and advocacy and activism of disabled communities themselves that really pushed forward models of thinking about disability and thinking about design, accessibility and accessible design. So the medical model, in the words of the disability theorist Rosemary Garland Thompson, is the view that disability is a transparent personal or a transparent tragedy and a personal misfortune. This view, I think, of limiting disability to its medical aspect alone. That is, we look at disabilities as physical medical problems inherent to the individual and for which the only true solution is a cure, and intermediate solutions are those that approximate the ability to live as a normal person in regular society. This approach really typified attempts at rehabilitation in the interwar and post-war periods, as returning veterans were taught to do various things independently so that they could most easily approximate, or most closely approximate, the ideal life of a post-war boom American person. Of course, this view in that context was both racialized and gendered, such that the ideal of humanity, of embodied perfection that they were meant to live up to, and class, of course. So the ideal of human perfection they were meant to live up to was the ideal of the white male head of household breadwinner. This model was responded to and rejected and theorized against starting in the 1960s in the UK with disabled advocacy, and really canonically, the classic theorization of this was by Mike Oliver in his 1984 book, The Biopolitics of Disablement, or I'm sorry, just the Politics of Disablement, and has since, there we go, sorry. The social model of disability, as articulated by Mike Oliver and many since, turns the medical model on its head. That is, instead of viewing the problem of disability as inhering in the body of the disabled person, it says bodies vary and come in many shapes and forms and different levels of abilities of different kinds. And it is the choices of the society in which people live that decide how disabling those bodily variations will be. Thus, it is not written in stone that having a limb difference or having not being able to walk should keep one homebound. Rather, it is the choices made by society in terms of the production and provision of wheelchairs and the design of open spaces with things like curb cuts and minimum widths for wheelchairs, et cetera, that design how disabling many of these conditions will be. It is since then, this movement also has been critiqued and nuanced by many who come after for its for many reasons. One is the degree to which it does not recognize the social construction of the medical side of disability itself, as well as that here again, as it was a sort of as it was promoted by the independent living movement in America, it has come under critique that independent living is not the goal of every disabled person. That this approach too ended up as it was really spearheaded by white, well-educated, middle-class people, that it reflected a certain cultural ideal still, as did the medical model. And so it has been critiqued from various avenues, such as more modern approaches tend to be initially race and class and gender conscious from the outset in a way that the social model was not. And so we get things like Alison Kafer's approach in Feminist Queer Crip, or the disability justice framework that was developed by Patty Byrne and others, or Leah Lakshmi Samarasinha's Dreaming Disability Dreams at the End of the World in her book Care Work. All of these affect our approach to accessibility. In the social model, as we saw, as I said, accessibility was not the burden of society. It was or the obligation of society. Rather, it was the burden of the individual person to fit as much as possible within the expectations of able-bodied society. We still see this thinking today in sort of the subtle eugenics of the COVID era, as well as a lot of the so-called inspiration porn that appears online, where you see, a girl who is a wheelchair user walking for the first time, even though it is not clear whether walking is healthy or ideal for her as a long-term transportation strategy. So as we move beyond the sort of the two poles of the medical and social model, we understand disability as a negotiation between individual and society, in which disabled people need to have an integral part in the design process. So one of the first key points in thinking accessibly is to include disabled people in the design and conceptualization process. But it goes much further beyond this. Instead of thinking of, for example, how we can design a product and then shift things around a little bit to make sure blind people or people with other disabilities can use it in the same way that able-bodied and sighted people do. We include the experiences and design needs of people with various disabilities from the beginning in an attempt to create a solution that is both more expansive and more inclusive. One of the things you'll find out very quickly using accessible technology and access technology is that accessibility is not a binary. It is not true that things are either accessible or not. Instead, accessibility is a spectrum where, of course, there is the lower level where you simply cannot complete a given task with a certain piece of technology. But on top of that, there are solutions where tasks can be completed with different degrees of difficulty, all the way up to accessible technology experiences that are efficient and elegant and joyful. In order to start thinking accessibly about the digital humanities, we need to address some common pitfalls. So this is one of my favorite cartoons to describe an unproductive way of thinking about accessibility. Here, the image is a 3-panel cartoon showing a dialogue between two people. The first person says, "You see this metal rectangle full of tiny little lights?" And the second person says, "Yeah." The first person says, "I spend most of my life, or most of my days, pressing buttons to change the pattern of lights to make them however I want." And the second person says, "Sounds good." And in the third panel, the first person says, "But today the pattern of lights is all wrong." And the second person says, "Oh God, try pressing more buttons." And the first person says, "It's not working." Now, this, apart from being an amusing way of describing either computer coding development or design or publication, represents, I think, a common way of thinking about it. If we can get it to look a certain way on the screen, then we've done it right. Unfortunately, this is one of the main, a major pitfall that causes problems for people with a bunch of disabilities, a number of disabilities. And in the digital space, we're particularly, but not only, talking about people with visual disabilities. So I call this screen essentialism because it assumes that if you get something to look a certain way, then you have fulfilled your design obligation. Instead, we need to move to a model where we make sure that we maintain a responsible ontology for all of our things. And I use the word things here because I was thinking of data, objects, fields, and I was like, all of those things. It's just things. It's very broad. To maintain a responsible ontology, things need to know what they are, and they need to know what they do. And we'll elaborate more on that later. And then from that point, we can feed things that have a responsible ontology into different kinds of software or hardware to translate them into various human readable formats. And so we also need to stop thinking monosensorily here and start thinking multisensorily. That is, if we think of text as a primarily visual phenomenon, then we will care most about how it appears on the screen. If we move away from thinking of text only as visual and think of it instead as a linguistic phenomenon that can be represented visually or auditorily or tactilely, then we can create, then that pushes us to that responsible ontology that allows greater engagement from a broader base of different people. As a blind person myself, I do not engage text visually anymore. Rather, I use text-to-speech software to get it auditorily, or I use Braille to get it tactilely. A big question, since most of you are data humanist or digital humanists, is how much of this is my job? That is, most of you are not going to be designing the tools that you're not designing computers, you're not designing hardware, many of you are not designing apps. So depending on your role and what you are creating, that question really depends. I was talking to my colleague Mae Veloso-Lyons about this, about the negotiation between those data sets that we create just for our own use for a single publication, and then those huge university funded and backed programs that create a large publicly accessible digital resource, and all of the spaces in between. There are situations in which you will be creating a small data set only for your personal use, and generally then the accessibility you care about is your own. However, the second you start thinking about sharing or publishing is the moment you need to start thinking about sharing or publishing across populations with different access needs. So and always err on the side of responsible data and publication creation, because thinking about these things from the beginning avoids that nasty term that has taken up more time and money than any of us would like to think about, which is remediation. When you've created something that is inaccessible or sloppily created, that then has to be fixed so that it can be shared in a more responsible way. So we're going to move on here to talking about a couple of specific cases. The first is accessibility in data. Now, one of the great things about digitization is that digitization is amazing. As a disabled person, I love the theory and the promise of digitization. In the world before the digitization of large amounts of text and data, it's estimated that far less than 1% of publications ever made it into a hard copy Braille format. That's still true. However, in the age of digitization, we now have digitized text that can be fed into various text-to-speech and Braille technologies, allowing for easier and more fluid access. Text that is, or any data or text that is digitized is more flexible, it's more fluid, it is more transferable, more transformable, and more shareable, but you just have to take care. You can see in the image I've included here that I have a large stack of Braille books. This is all actually the volumes of the same book. This is 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, sitting next to my first Braille display, which was able to hold a lot more than one book, and also to connect to my computer and my iPhone to get Braille readable text files from a wide variety of sources. So the efficiency and the scale of digitized text makes digitization a very promising development. Now, what are things that we need to think about when we are encoding data accessibly? The good news here is that most of these best practices will also be best practices just for responsible data creation that leads to better transferability and transformability and sharing. Most of these fall under the rubric of just responsible data production. So for example, when we are encoding text, I work very heavily in multilingual environments. I use English, French, German, Hebrew, et cetera, on a regular basis. So one of the things that is very important when you are encoding multilingual text is to make sure that it is encoded properly using Unicode, such as the UTF-8 standard, rather than any of a number of other standards that don't work, that are not as robust or shareable. And I'll give some examples of those and show some demonstrations when we did the screen reader demo. The second is OCR data. Since most or a large amount of digital text is being digitized by OCRing, scanning and OCRing print materials, the creation of large OCR corpuses leads to, OCR is how we get a lot of our text. So in the process of OCR, you have to make sure that the text you're getting out is cleaned, and there are all sorts of artifacts that show up when you OCR. Oftentimes there are misspelled characters, line breaks and spaces in the wrong places, and sometimes it will misunderstand a mark on the page as a punctuation mark or a character in a language that doesn't fit the rest of the text. So you get all sorts of strange artifacts. This is something you need to do when you're making a digitized text corpus in any event. So these two things shouldn't come as any surprise to people who work with humanistic data on a regular basis. The second is when we're encoding variables in a data set or a spreadsheet or a database. And the key here is just to make sure that we maintain that responsible ontology, and we encode variables in ways that will be apparent to screen readers or to people using different types of technology to access it. One of the major pitfalls here is, for example, using color coding for variables in spreadsheets. To show different types of artifacts, you color code them differently. This is hard, not only from an accessibility standpoint, but also if you ever want to transform or share your data set, those sorts of things are difficult to do. All right. Moving on to accessibility in presentation, from the creation of our data sets to the creation of means of sharing, publishing, showing, presenting, etc. And here I'm just going to do a very high level overview so we can move on to the screen reader demonstration. But an acronym to keep in mind here is POUR, and this is from the WCAG 2.1 web accessibility, the World Wide Web Consortium Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 are guided by these principles of building POUR websites or POUR publications, POUR resources, etc. The first letter P stands for perceivable. That is, any information should be able to be perceived by people with different types of disabilities. So this is where that multisensory thinking comes in. When we're talking about visual information, such as text, images, we need to find ways to represent that information not only visually, but also auditorily and tactilely. This is also very important for people with who are hard of hearing or deaf. That is, when we have auditory information such as narration, music, speech, video, we need to make sure that the auditory information is represented usually visually through, for example, text captioning, transcripts, ASL interpretation, etc. And then for deafblind audiences, that we can do that same captioning fed through a Braille display or in another way that can ensure access. The O is for operable. This has to do with the interaction. This, as you can imagine, is intrinsically tied in with perceivability. Something that can't be perceived can't be operated upon. So for example, if you have fancily coded sliders or hover states on your websites, those are going to end up being inaccessible because they can't be perceived. This is also true for things like CAPTCHAs. If, on the other hand, this is important for people with varieties of motor disabilities. That is, there are design elements that are hostile to people who use non-standard techniques of interacting with their computers, such as eye trackers or mouth sticks. Things with short timers tend to be very hostile to those sorts of users who may take a little more time to navigate or enter the same information. Understandable is something to keep in mind since we will have audiences who have a variety of cognitive disabilities of different types, learning or reading disabilities, but also it is important in the design of design flows, of user flows, such that people know where to go to do what they need to do on a site, or how to get to part of a site or a resource they need to get to. Robust deals with, in many ways, the sort of responsible data practices I was talking about. That is, designing not just to get the minimum viable visual, but designing in such a way that that whatever you're producing will be backward compatible and forward compatible, and will transferable from desktop to laptop to mobile, etc. Wait, hold on. All right, so some best practices associated with those core principles for every site and publication you come up with. And keep in mind what I said about thinking accessibly, which is responsible ontology. Things need to know what they are, and things need to know what they do. So one of the best things you can do to help people with visual impairments navigate digital resources is to use headings. Don't just use formatting, that is, don't make it bigger and bolder, but also make sure that it is tagged as a heading with the HTML tag so that the screen reader knows it is a heading. This is a really quick way that visually impaired and blind people navigate websites or get the feel of an online resource or site by navigating through headings and subheadings. Second, label all your buttons. Sometimes a button will be a picture, but then the screen reader navigates to it and it just says button. And we have all learned from action movies and thrillers that you do not push buttons if you do not know what they do. So labeling all your buttons, not only visually, that is putting on the appropriate image, but also by including a label tag in the button to say what it does, is very helpful to visually impaired users. Whenever you have images, please include alt text. This is the easiest way to make sure that visual information gets communicated to people with visual impairments. And I can really talk for hours about different types of alt text for different types of images and different types of graphs and visualizations. As if you'll notice, when I was going through the slideshow, there were two images. There was the cartoon and then there was the image, and I made sure to describe them both in the course of the presentation as well. If you download this slide deck off my website later, you'll find that they both also have alt text underneath them so that they can be read using a screen reader. But the hallmark of good accessible production is also getting accessibility testing. You can use automated web accessibility checkers, which are a great first step, but the only way to ensure that you are creating a good user experience for disabled users is to do human testing. So if you have a large public project, that make sure that your design and production plan includes time and funds for human testing. Considering CESTA does a lot with data visualization and representation, this is an important thing to talk about, but I'm going to have to tell you to stay tuned, because in the spring we are going to bring in another speaker to talk more about data visualization and its representation in non-visual modalities, sort of on the cutting edge of technology in that field. So stay tuned for that talk. And I am going to stop this screen share now. Give you a little time to think while I set up my new screen share. First, I'm going to show you some of the ways that I meant to show these earlier, but wanted to have the full screen. When we're talking about the representation of text in non-visual ways, this is one of the key tools that blind users use. This is an electronic braille display. This one is the Mantis Q40, which has a full QWERTY keyboard as well as braille command buttons. And you can see at the bottom here, there is a line of braille cells. There are 40 braille cells, such that whatever text is being represented on the device that this is connected to, either the laptop or the phone, will be displayed on the braille display instead of on, or in addition to on the screen. So that is one way that I do a lot of reading of text, of close reading of text, especially in foreign languages. And now, okay, now I am going to set up my screen share with the screen reader audio so that we can, here, so be prepared to be inundated with sound.
Started screen share. Screen sharing has stopped as the shared window is closed. You are screen sharing.
All right. Now you can hear this voice when you are using a screen reader. The screen reader takes whatever textual information is under the focus of the screen reader cursor and creates sound with it for you to navigate. So we are going to first.
Microsoft Word. Safari.
I do have to tell you the latest update of Mac OS changed the algorithm for automatic language detection. And since I have a bunch of different language voices installed, sometimes the German voice will grab the mic when text is not in German. The French and Hebrew voices generally have pretty good boundaries, but the German voice is a little overzealous. So you're going to hear, for example, they're switching to Microsoft Word. She does that in German.
Finder. Safari.
So
Safari. Google window.
First, I just wanted to give you a sense of how this screen reader works and how I would use it to navigate a website. Just also for your information, this is the built-in screen reader in Mac OS called VoiceOver. Windows users use different screen readers, either JAWS or NVDA, that operate slightly differently, but with the same general theory of either translating what is under the cursor into speech through a text-to-speech engine or into Braille through a Braille translation engine.
Open location. https
So,
www.google.com.
let's say I want to go to a website such as the Center for Spatial Analysis, Spatial and Textual Analysis at Stanford. So I get a page of Google search results, and also, oh, you can also, I'm going to slow this down for you all. I speed up the voice because I want to be efficient, but I understand that not everybody listens at that speed.
Rate 100%.
So
60%.
I'll switch it down to 50.
Closing. Rate menu. Accessibility links.
To me, this is insufferably slow, but hopefully that's a little more comprehensible. So I can choose to navigate this website a bunch of different ways.
Form controls.
So you can navigate by
Headings.
form
Links.
controls, headings,
Window spots.
links,
Words.
window spots,
Characters. Navigation.
words, characters,
Landmarks. Form headings.
etc. I'm going to do headings because that's the easiest
Search
way
modes.
to go
Search
through
results.
different through the different links that show up in the search
Web
results.
results with site links. Center for Spatial and Textual Analysis. Center for Space
And so you can
Accessibility.
see
Center
why
for Spatial
using
and
proper
Textual
headings
Analysis
is very
vertical line.
important.
Report alleged copyright infringement. Form controls. Headings. Contact us. Connect.
And then we can go to the Accessibly page.
Chat 3 item in the
I'm
carousel.
not sure why it had me at the bottom there, but you can see that I can navigate
Carousel start.
through the heading.
What is Testa?
In addition to navigating by different page elements like that, you can also just move left and right using the voiceover cursor.
Chesta is Stanford's digital humanities research hub, where students and faculty bring the power of humanistic investigation together with new technology to document, analyze,
you
and
move
understand
onto
the
it and
changing
it reads
human
the
experience.
text for you. So that is just some basic screen reader navigation. And I'll be happy to talk more about that in the Q&A if anybody has questions.
Zoom.us. Microsoft PowerPoint.
I wanted to give some
Word. Corey M. Johnson. Zoom.us. Corey M. Johnson. View. Safari. Word. Document characters. Navigate. Corey M. Johnson has 20 window spots. Words. Window navigation. Characters. Words. Window spot. Navigation. Audio submenu. Safari. Center for
Microsoft Word.
Word.
So
Document 1. Window. Page 1 content. Insertion at the beginning of text.
Zoom notifications keep interfering
text
with my
encoding
keyboard
examples.
commands.
German. Good.
So
Characters.
I may have to switch windows like that
navigation.
occasionally.
Talaya Anderson entered window spots.
Whenever
1.
anybody
Talaya
enters
Anderson
the
has
waiting
joined the
room.
meeting. Characters. Navigate window spots.
And there it did again.
Safari.
Microsoft
Word. Misspelled. Lines.
Okay.
Sentences. Paragraph. Link. Table. Heading.
So you can see here, I can navigate not only
German. Text encoding
I can
examples.
navigate not only web page, but documents by headings as long as the headings are properly encoded. So this is my example of text encoding and the problems that it can create for screen reader users if text is not encoded properly.
Table. Heading. Table. Link.
So
paragraphs.
I will switch from navigating by heading to navigating by paragraph.
New line. German.
Moving first to some text that is in German. This is the opening line of Franz Kafka's Die Verwandlung, or the Metamorphosis, in German.
Good.
And you can see when it is properly encoded.
Als Gregor Samsa eines Morgens aus unruhigen Träumen erwachte, fand sich in seinem Bett zu einem ungeheuren Ungeziefer-Star verwandelt.
We are very responsibly led into Gregor Samsa's adventures by the German voice. However, if it is wrongly encoded,
bad,
you get something like this.
Gregor Samsen morgens enregistrement erwacht, fand sich in seinem Bett zu einem ungeziefer verwandelt.
That's the system thinks that this text is in French, and so the French voice is reading it, and it is completely incomprehensible. So that is the one important aspect of making sure your language is encoded properly as the correct language.
New
Hebrew.
Bigger problems have arisen in texts with other languages with completely different scripts that don't use the Latin script set or the alphabet characters. And here, this is not only a lesson in improper encoding, but a good object lesson in the sorts of problems that remediation can cause.
Bad.
So back in the old days when people in Hebrew and biblical studies first wanted to start doing digital humanities, they were dealing with ASCII, which did not have the Hebrew alphabet in its character set. And so they encoded their texts through these bizarre font masks where they took characters that had values in the ASCII character set and then just put a pretty font mask picture on them. So this is one of your key examples of objects that look good, but do not know what they are in any responsible fashion. So if we go to the next line, this is Genesis 1:1, the very beginning of the Hebrew Bible, and we get this beautiful readout.
X registered sign R.EHTA lozenge WMY and LVTA iota partial differential road. B B general 1, 1.
I think it's obvious to pretty much everyone that it should be that is not Hebrew. It is not anything because it's the use of font mask. Since then, it has become much easier using Unicode to responsibly encode Hebrew text. And so for Hebrew text to be readable by screen readers and by Braille translation engines.
New line.
So
good.
In the next case, we get
General 1, 1.
בראשית ברא אלוהים את השמיים ואת הארץ.
the text being read as Hebrew text by a Hebrew voice, and which is much, much more comprehensible. Now, a lot of the text search programs that were written using the font masks needed to be remediated to fit the Unicode standard because people who got used to using Unicode no longer tolerated switching between the two methods, and the difficulty of doing many sorts of text transformations and searching using the font masks. Luckily, font masks are not in use much anymore, but it's just a good reminder that a lot of this sort of bootstrapping or data creation without thought for the future or the best possible way of doing it leads to much more effort later on in the process of remediation. That I'm going to see how much time I have. I know it's just about where I should be wrapping up my talk, and I would be happy to do that. I
Safari.
had
Safari. Center for Spatial and
a
Textual
few other
Analysis
things I
vertical line,
wanted to
window.
look at.
Test
Just
is
real,
Stanford's Digital Humanities Research Hub, where student accessible university demo site, inaccessible version.
real quick. There is the University of Washington made this fake web page for Accessible University, which highlights a bunch of common accessibility problems that would take too long to go over, but you can see
Form controls, links, window spots, links.
I
form
can't even
controls.
navigate by headings because there are no headings on this page.
Accessible universe, accessible vertical splitter, accessible in admit.
I can still navigate left and right
line, bienvenido,
to
accessible
get
universidad,
to
UAE,
different portions of the web page, but
PNG.
you can see the image there is simply
Arrow right dot PNG.
labeled the file name, which is not good alt text. And then if you look at there's a form on the side of the web page that says required fields are in blue to anybody with color processing difficulties or severe profound visual impairment. That's going to be completely useless. They made
admissions menu bar for items,
a remediated accessible version of the website that is much better. It has headings, it has proper language encoding, it has proper form control encodings, including radio buttons and text fields that are marked as required instead of blue. So I realize there are a lot of unanswered questions. I've barely been able to scratch the surface here. So there are, if you have further questions,
resources for accessibility
I would
in the
invite
digital
you to
humanities
go
vertical line,
to
Blind Scholar.
my website, blindscholar.com,
Landmarks, form controls, headings,
and you can find
Blind Scholar, personal blog, resources for accessibility in the digital
resources for
humanities,
accessibility in the digital humanities.
theory and principles for web accessibility in general.
There is sort of theory and best and principles, as well as best practices. I found that Web AIM, Web Accessibility in Mind, is one of the most informative and well-structured sites in this regard. But there's also a bunch of other resources
For the
here
digital humanity, accessibility of biblical texts and languages,
for digital humanities, for biblical texts and
accessibility
languages,
testing tools,
for testing
automated web
tools.
accessibility
And I'm going
checkers.
to add a few more things that I found to this over the next couple of days, because I found some very nice resources about describing data visualizations and those sorts of things. So with that,
for
I'm
theory
going
and
to
principles.
unshare my screen and audio and I'll be happy to take questions or to talk more about anything specific that you are curious about. Thank you very much.
Save as.